I never expected a simple request for class notes to turn into one of those moments that stays with you, replaying in your mind like a favorite song on repeat. Let me take you back to last semester when my roommate Jake and I were still figuring out our dynamic in the small two-bedroom apartment we'd been sharing for about 4 months. We'd met through a university housing forum, both of us second-year students looking for affordable off-campus housing. I'd known I was gay since high school, and while I wasn't hiding it, it just hadn't come up in conversation with Jake yet. He had all the markers of the stereotypical straight guy, sports posters on his wall, a rotating cast of female friends who'd come by to study, and that particular brand of casual masculinity that straight men wear like a comfortable old t-shirt. Our apartment wasn't anything special, just your standard student housing with thin walls, a tiny kitchen with barely enough counter space to make a sandwich, and a shared bathroom where we'd established an unspoken schedule to avoid awkward morning encounters. My bedroom was my sanctuary. I'd invested in good bedding, a decent desk lamp, and had actually hung proper curtains instead of the cheap blinds that came with the place. Jake's room, by contrast, looked like it was still waiting for someone to properly move in, even months after we'd signed the lease. We got along well enough, the kind of friendship built on mutual respect for shared space rather than deep personal connection. We'd chat about classes, split the grocery bills fairly, and occasionally watch a game or movie together in the living room. It was comfortable, uncomplicated, until that Tuesday in October when everything shifted in ways I couldn't have anticipated. It was midterm season, and everyone on campus had that frantic, sleep-deprived energy that comes with trying to cram an entire half-semester's worth of knowledge into their brains. Jake had missed our shared contemporary literature class the previous week, a 3-hour lecture that happened to cover material worth about 30% of our upcoming exam. I'd taken meticulous notes, as was my habit. I color-coded important concepts, drew connection diagrams in the margins, and even included the professor's offhand comments that often ended up being test questions. The class was one of those core requirements that everyone had to take regardless of major. Jake was studying business while I was in communications, but we'd both put off taking this particular requirement until second year. The course material wasn't especially difficult, but Professor Harrington had a reputation for exams that tested not just your knowledge of the texts, but your ability to connect themes across multiple works. Missing a week of her lectures was essentially academic suicide. I was at my desk, highlighting passages in my textbook when I heard a knock on my bedroom door. Jake stood there, looking uncharacteristically stressed, his usually perfectly styled hair slightly disheveled, as if he'd been running his hands through it repeatedly. "Hey, I know this is last minute," he started, leaning against my doorframe with forced casualness that didn't match the worry in his eyes. "But I missed Harrington's lecture last week, and everyone says she covered the modernist influences that'll be on the midterm. Any chance I could borrow your notes?" The thing about my notes is that they're not really designed for anyone else. They're a system that makes perfect sense to me, but might as well be written in code to others. I've had friends try to study from them before, only to call me in frustration asking what my arrows and symbols meant. "You can borrow them," I said, reaching for my literature notebook. "But honestly, they probably won't make much sense without me explaining them. Harrington went deep on Joyce and Woolf last week, and there are a lot of connections to earlier texts that won't be obvious from just the notes." Jake looked at the notebook I was holding out, then back at me with a hopeful expression. "Any chance you could walk me through them? I'm seriously drowning here, and the exam's in 3 days." I hesitated for just a moment. It wasn't that I minded helping him, but explaining my notes would take time I'd planned to use for my own studying. But there was something in his expression, a vulnerability I hadn't seen before in my usually confident roommate, that made it impossible to say no. "Sure," I agreed. "I've got about an hour now if that works for you." What I expected was that we'd sit at my desk, or maybe move to the kitchen table. What I didn't expect was for Jake to glance around my room, and then casually settle himself on my bed, back against the wall, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. "Is this okay?" he asked, patting the space beside him. "It'll be easier to see the notes if we're looking at them from the same angle." There was a logic to it that I couldn't argue with, so I found myself sitting beside him on my bed, the notebook open between us, acutely aware of the few inches of space separating our shoulders. I could smell his cologne, something with sandalwood and citrus, and noticed the way his forearm tensed slightly as he reached to point at something in my notes. Let me explain why this matters. When you're attracted to someone you're not supposed to be attracted to, every casual touch, every accidental brush of shoulders becomes charged with meaning that exists only in your head. I'd been careful to keep my attraction to certain guys, especially straight ones, firmly in check. I'd learned that lesson the hard way in high school. But sitting there with Jake, in the private space of my bedroom, going through my notes together, I felt that careful boundary starting to blur. The study session started formally enough. I explained Professor Harrington's central thesis about modernist literature as a response to societal fragmentation. I walked him through my notes on Ulysses and Mrs. Dalloway, pointing out the stream of consciousness techniques and how they reflected changing perceptions of time and reality in the early 20th century. So basically, these writers were trying to show how messy and disconnected people's actual thoughts are. Jake asked, leaning closer to look at a particular passage I'd highlighted. Exactly, I said, surprised by his quick grasp of the concept. It wasn't just stylistic experimentation. They were rejecting the idea that human experience could be captured in neat, linear narratives. As we continued through the notes, the formality of the study session gradually dissolved. Jake kicked off his shoes and shifted to get more comfortable. I found myself relaxing too, the initial awkwardness giving way to the natural rhythm of conversation. What had started as a straightforward explanation of class notes evolved into a genuine discussion about literature and ideas. I never thought I'd actually find this stuff interesting, Jake admitted after we'd been talking for nearly 2 hours, well beyond the hour I'd initially offered. In high school, English was just something to get through. What changed? I asked, genuinely curious. He was quiet for a moment, thoughtful in a way I hadn't seen before. I guess I started seeing how it connects to real life. Like, we're all just trying to make sense of our experiences, right? These writers were doing that too, just in a different time with different challenges. There was something intimate about hearing Jake express a thought so personal, so reflective. It wasn't the kind of conversation we typically had over breakfast or while deciding whose turn it was to buy toilet paper. In that moment, he wasn't just the easygoing roommate who occasionally left dishes in the sink. He was revealing himself to be thoughtful, insightful, more complex than I'd given him credit for. As the afternoon light began to shift, casting long shadows across my bedroom floor, our conversation drifted from literature to personal stories. Jake told me about growing up in a small town where academic achievement wasn't particularly valued, how his business major was a compromise with parents who didn't see the point of college unless it led directly to a job. What about you? He asked, turning to face me more directly. Communication seems to fit you, but was it always what you wanted to do? The question caught me off guard, not because it was particularly profound, but because it suggested an interest in my life that extended beyond our convenient living arrangement. I told him about my early love of writing, how I'd originally wanted to study journalism, but had been drawn to the broader field of communications. I like understanding how people connect, I explained, how stories shape the way we see the world and each other. Jake nodded, his expression thoughtful. That makes sense. You're a good listener. I've noticed that about you. There was something in the way he said it, direct, appreciative, that made me feel suddenly seen in a way I hadn't realized I was craving. Our conversation continued to meander, touching on family dynamics, future aspirations, the music we'd grown up listening to. The literature notes lay forgotten between us, our study session having transformed into something else entirely. I became aware of how comfortable we'd become physically as well. The careful space I'd maintained at the beginning had disappeared. Our shoulders were touching now, and neither of us had moved away. At one point, Jake laughed at something I said, his whole body shaking with it, and he briefly rested his hand on my knee as if to steady himself. The casual touch sent a jolt through me that I tried desperately to ignore. I should probably get back to studying, I said eventually, not because I wanted the conversation to end, but because I needed some distance to recalibrate my thoughts. Yeah, of course, Jake agreed, though he made no immediate move to leave. Instead, he picked up the notebook again, flipping through pages we hadn't gotten to. Your notes really are amazing, though. The way you make connections between ideas. It's like you see patterns most people miss. The compliment warmed me in a way that felt dangerous. Thanks, I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. It's just how my brain works, I guess. Jake finally stood up, stretching in a way that momentarily revealed a strip of skin above his jeans. I looked away quickly, busying myself with reorganizing papers on my desk. "Thanks for this," he said, gesturing vaguely to encompass both the notes and the hours of conversation. "Seriously, you saved me. And it was nice talking like this. Anytime," I replied, meaning it despite knowing it might be wiser to maintain some emotional distance. After Jake left my room, I sat on the edge of my bed, trying to process what had just happened. Nothing, really, just a study session between roommates that had evolved into a deeper conversation. Yet it felt significant, as if something had shifted in the foundation of our friendship. In the days that followed, I noticed subtle changes in our interactions. Jake would linger in the kitchen in the mornings, initiating conversations rather than just exchanging brief greetings before rushing off to class. He started asking my opinion on papers he was writing for other classes. Once, he brought home my favorite coffee drink without me having mentioned I was craving it. The midterm came and went. Both of us did well, though Jake insisted it was entirely thanks to my notes and explanations. We celebrated with takeout and beers in our living room, and I couldn't help noticing how he chose to sit beside me on the couch rather than in the armchair he usually claimed. "We should study together more often," he suggested that night, his shoulder casually pressed against mine as we scrolled through movie options. "I think I retain information better when I'm discussing it with someone else." I agreed, despite knowing that each study session would be an exercise in maintaining boundaries that seemed increasingly fluid. Because the truth was, I enjoyed his company in a way that went beyond simple friendship or attraction. There was an ease to our conversations now, a depth that had been missing before. 2 weeks after that first study session on my bed, Jake knocked on my door again, this time holding his own notebook. "I took really good notes in Harrington's class today," he said with a hint of pride. "Thought maybe we could compare them, see if I missed anything important." I stepped back to let him in, watching as he settled onto my bed without hesitation, as if it had become his designated spot in my room. As I sat down beside him, I was struck by how quickly the extraordinary can become ordinary, how a moment that once seemed charged with significance can evolve into comfortable routine. I still don't know where this is going, this friendship that feels like it's constantly on the verge of becoming something else. Maybe it never will. Maybe Jake is just one of those rare straight guys who's comfortable with emotional intimacy and physical closeness. Or maybe there's something more developing between us, something neither of us has found the words to acknowledge yet. What I do know is that sometimes the most significant connections in our lives begin in the most ordinary ways, with a request for class notes, with an afternoon spent talking on a bed, with the gradual discovery that the person you've been living alongside is someone you actually want to know. And whether or not our relationship ever crosses the boundary from friendship to something more, I'm grateful for that afternoon when my straight roommate asked for notes from class and stayed to read them on my bed, not because of what it might lead to, but because of what it already was, a genuine connection, unexpected and valuable in its own right. As we continue to navigate this evolving relationship, I'm trying to stay present in each moment rather than analyzing what it all means. Some days it feels like we're dancing around something unspoken. Other days it's simply the comfortable friendship of two people who enjoy each other's company. Either way, I've learned that the most meaningful connections often happen in these in-between spaces, not in grand declarations or dramatic moments, but in quiet afternoons spent talking, in the gradual revealing of ourselves to another person who actually wants to listen. Maybe that's enough. Maybe it isn't. But for now, I'm choosing to appreciate what we have rather than worrying about what we might become. After all, isn't that what all those modernist writers were trying to tell us? That life happens in these fragmented moments of connection, and the meaning comes not from some perfect narrative resolution, but from our willingness to be present within the complexity of human relationships, however they might evolve. Total_char_count, 13,842.